Alright, then moving on to the next one. Newer research suggests women are more prone to psychological problems such as depression, largely due in part to differences in the brains of men and women. Our next panel is all about mind matters. Women's mental health, navigating challenges, building resilience. Ladies and gentlemen, now I would like to invite on the stage Ms. Deepthi Chandy, therapist and chief operating officer, Anna Chandy and Associates. Deep Chandy is a strong believer in the power of therapy and is passionate about the movement to normalize therapy. Can we all give her a huge round of applause, everyone? Next, I would like to invite Dr. Vandana Shetty, renowned psychiatrist and founder of Sage Health. Dr. Vandana Shetty is also a psychotherapist and a sexual health expert with 10 years of both clinical and research experience in this field. A huge round of applause for Dr. Vandana Shetty. Next, I would like to invite Ms. Smita Murthy, co-founder Mind Stories, India's first content-led mental health platform. Can we all give her a huge round of applause, everyone? Ms. Smita Murthy.
So you can use one of these mics. Hi everyone, good afternoon. All right, we have about 25 minutes, so we'll get straight on to it. I'm not the expert here, so you guys are the experts. I'm not going to spend too much time sort of setting the context. Let's dive straight in. Dr. Vandana, why don't you start by contextualizing this silent mental health crisis that women are experiencing? What is the prevalence? And if you can also talk about some of the differences between mental illness when it comes to women and men. You can grab one of the mics.
Hi, good morning to everyone here. Thank you, Brian. I think it's very important that the focus is shifting to health of women, especially mental health. So I think what's happened with traditional research into mental health is it's never, till just a few decades ago, not been focusing specifically on what's happening with women. But we have seen over time that there's some things that are very unique to the mental health of women, which makes it very different and needs that specific attention. Starting from biology itself, we've seen that post-puberty, girls are more prone than boys of the same age for different kinds of mental concerns. And then there are these peaks which come typically around childbearing, perimenopausal, even around the menstruation cycle every month, women are more susceptible. So we know that hormonally also girls might be more susceptible to mental illnesses or mental health concerns than boys. But apart from that, if we go beyond the biology, we know that there are a lot of social factors and cultural factors which aggravate the situation. And this is only getting attention now in the last few years. If we talk about gender roles, women have typically assumed the caregiver roles. So whether it's taking care of the old, taking care of the children at home, it's always been the ladies who've been at the forefront. Now with the changing work dynamic, what's happening is women are also assuming employment roles outside of the house. But that's not eased them from the home responsibilities, so domestic duties. So now it's an added responsibility which adds more mental health pressure, because most women we meet would tell us that they don't have adequate support, they don't feel heard. So even the equality when it comes to work, pay parity comes at a cost, because they're now overworked in two domains of their life, right? So it's about gender roles, and even socially, once a woman, there's a lot of stigma for women to come up and say that they have mental health concerns. And we cannot overlook the effect of violence. So there are a lot of studies. For example, a UN study just a few years ago showed that almost 2/3 of married women are subject to some kind of domestic violence. And if you look at gender-based violence, almost close to 15 to 50% of women would have faced violence at some point in their lives. It could be in the form of physical or sexual abuse. So that's a huge number, and it has a very deep impact on the mental health of women. And if women who are subjected to violence are very likely to develop some form of mental health concern, mostly in the form of anxiety, post-traumatic stress, depression. But then they become even more vulnerable to abuse. So if you compare mentally ill women versus mentally well women, again the rate of abuse doubles. So, even the illness brings more problems along with it. So it's a very vicious cycle which I think needs to be broken at like various levels, but there's a lot that goes into it beyond biology. There's a lot of cultural factors and social factors too.
Sure. Thank you for contextualizing that. In terms of numbers, Lancet psychiatry survey prior to the pandemic back in 2017, I think, and the results were released in 2018, talked about 200 million Indians experiencing some form of mental disorder. Now, give us a sense of how many of those are women.
See, if we compare numbers, we know that whether it's depression or anxiety, women are at least 3 times more likely to have anxiety or depression compared to men. So, we have our Indian data. The most recent is the National Mental Health Survey, which completed in 2016. So, even in that, if you see the average rate of depression lifetime is around 12%. But if you divide that between genders, the risk for men would be around 5 to 12%. But for women, it doubles. It's almost around 18 to 25%. So even in our Indian data, we know that women are going to have double the rates than men. It's at least 2 to 3 times. But help seeking, the rates may not be comparable, because help seeking, when it comes to that, women may not actually seek out help as much as men would.
Sure, we'll come to that. So Smita, I want to bring you in. Why don't you share your experience? I know that you co-founded Life Wordsmith, which is a content company, and of course Mind Stories. So what led you to start Mind Stories? That's one question. Secondly, through your own journey and your lived experience, did you feel supported? And if you didn't, what would you like to change about how you would have liked to have been supported from a healthcare infrastructure standpoint, not so much from a personal family support standpoint? So why did you talk about those two aspects?
Yeah, so the first thing is, I would say I started Mind Stories partly because I went through a pretty harrowing time after COVID. Right. And I realized at that point of time that I'd taken a lot of my mental health for granted. And it's only when you lose something that you kind of realize that, oh, this was something that was there all along, it was supporting me, and now that I kind of have gone through a fairly traumatic experience, that was the COVID second wave and the aftermath of it. So that's when I realized that there is something, I've always been a fitness person, but I hadn't really taken care of my mental health. And it was during that time that I started to seek out resources, I started to look at apps, I started to look at the entire digital infrastructure that exists. And I felt that there was, although there is a lot of technology on hand to support mental health, there was nothing that I could say was tailored to an Indian context. It wasn't specific to what I was looking for. I wanted information, but that information came from a Western context. And I just did not feel like just going to an app would have supported me. So that's how we started Mind Stories, with the intent of providing first information, conversations, and like it was also said earlier as well, there's a lot of stigma around mental health. We just don't feel right in admitting that we're going for therapy, nor do we say that as easily as say, I'm going to visit my diabetologist or I'm going to the gym, right? So one of the first things we wanted to do with Mind Stories was to reduce the stigma, and the way we wanted to do it is partly because I have a lot of work in content, to work through the field of content, to generate more conversations, to use the power of storytelling, and to gradually build an entire digital ecosystem around mental wellness. It was, I think, partly born out of a need that I was seeking something and I couldn't find it, and then I thought I might as well create it.
Sure, that's great. And if you can talk about, how you went through your journey and the support you received or did not receive from the mental health ecosystem.
Yeah, so I hadn't really considered therapy. I just felt like I'm too cool for therapy for a long time. And as I said, it's only when I realized that I was really struggling mentally, and I felt like I needed to reach out and get support. And that support did not necessarily have to come from, say, family. It did not have to come from friends. Friends were very supportive. But you do realize that the support comes with a certain limitation. You needed more professional help. So I started to look at apps. I started to look at see if I can get a right therapist. But that process itself can be pretty overwhelming. And that's where I felt like we have a plethora of apps, but we don't really know how to take the first step to actually take the initiative to kind of figure out, okay, what kind of therapist do I need, for example. I was totally clueless. And both the mental health professionals here would probably laugh at me. I actually chose my therapist because she had pink hair. I had absolutely no other idea as to how I could choose a therapist. And it's only now that I realize that you have different kinds of therapy, and you can obviously choose a trauma-informed therapist, or you can choose somebody else who's aligned with different modalities such as CBT. But at that point of time, I didn't know. Right. And that's one gap that I feel is not addressed. We know we ought to seek help, and then there are all these apps that promise to give you that help. But it's not as simple as getting on an app and just clicking on a therapist and then just saying, okay, yeah, I'm taking care of my mental health. I think that a lack of knowledge sometimes can set you back.
Sure. So we've identified two aspects really. I think there's clearly the large incidence of mental health problems in women, and there is this problem that Smita has identified. How do you go about seeking and sifting through all of the resources that are there? One of the things that you mentioned was quite interesting, Smita, this context, the Indian context to therapy, right? And I want to bring in Deepthi to talk a little bit about, because I know that your firm has clients across the world who are seeking particularly therapy support within the framework of an Indian sort of context. So maybe you talk a little bit about that and then address Smita's issue that she brought about how does one go about sifting through the various options that are there, the apps that are there, the therapists that are there. So two parts of it really.
Yeah, I think as Dr. Vandana said, the context, culture forms an important part of mental health. And I think in our culture where traditionally we have very, very gender roles that are sort of very deeply culturally ingrained, and that takes a lot of time to work with or to process. So I think for us, what COVID did was the access. We were forced to actually think out of the box. Therapy was no longer you go to someone or see them. You can see them on Zoom, FaceTime, WhatsApp, whatever. And today we work with clients in almost 45 countries, because what they say is we don't want to explain boundaries. For example, our Indian understanding of boundaries is I can go next door and say hello to the person and I'm not violating their boundary. But in the West, I may have to practically make an appointment and go. And so even explaining that to a Western therapist wastes so much time, whereas we immediately understand those finer nuances. So I think culture plays a very, very important role, and also what we expect ourselves to do as women. So as woke as we all may be over here, we look fashionable, we've dressed up, but I would still make sure that things at home are done before I leave. Right. Because we ourselves have sort of placed those gender sort of stereotypes on ourselves. Yeah. So I think culture plays an extremely important role. I'm really glad Smita spoke about how do you sift through therapists, because Dr. Vandana and I practice out of Indranagar, but if you throw a stone in Indranagar, it will land on a therapist's head, because almost everyone's a therapist today. I think there are multiple factors, and one is, of course, cost. So there are people who can afford, and unfortunately mental health is considered, depression is considered as a rich person's disease, or you have the luxury of having a mental health issue. So I think one is cost. So there's a lot around, okay, what kind of costing am I looking at? And then also, I really think it's important. I totally get it. Pink hair made you feel connected to her in some way, and you never know what that connection is. So I think that's a very important factor. Of course, they should also be
Sorry.
ethical, etc. This is
Excuse me?
also quite important. The other thing I think is with apps, my personal experience is that a lot of our clients say that this is still one
Sorry,
place.
one moment. I'd like to request anybody who's conversing to take the discussions offline outside because it's disturbing the panelists. Thank you. Excuse me? Excuse me? Okay, please
So
continue.
I think what's important is that you actually are, ethical about what you make sure that your therapist is also ethical, and that's also something that's really important.
So, I'll direct this question to the both of you. What are some of the innovative models that have sort of come through in the last couple of years? Because the pandemic, I think, resulted in a lot of innovation for many businesses or in many sectors. What are some of the things that you all have seen that have emerged?
Yeah, I think with the corporates we work with, I'm glad mental health became a sort of a buzzword and the in thing. Like everyone wanted to have something around mental health, women's mental health, the pandemic and mental health. There were all these innovative terms, and I'm glad because we need to bring awareness to mental health. But I think we all had a lot of psychoeducation sessions, and global firms had it all across the world with teams across the world. That was important. I think access became a lot more, so we were thinking out of the box, like I mentioned. Today I have clients on FaceTime, on Zoom, on WhatsApp, doesn't matter. Traditionally and I still prefer to see people in person. I think there's nothing like seeing that person, but online works as well. I think the third thing that it did was, for example, we work with a business family that benefited from therapy and then wanted to offer back to the community and started a project in a small town near Madurai that they're from. And this was where we tried to we trained lay counselors who were women who were then offering like a first level of support. So I think there was so much innovation that happened. So we're talking about corporates, which is privilege. We're talking about access to mid-level, higher income groups and lower income groups, and then at the grassroots, which I think is such a big part of our country, how do we offer it there as well?
Dr. Vandana?
Yeah, I totally agree with Deepthi. I think COVID changed the mental health scene across the world, and there's a lot more openness now, which is, we're still far from where we want to be, but it's definitely come forward by a lot of, by leaps, I would say. I think tele-mental health has really taken over. So we have a lot of apps now. Unfortunately, we don't have regulatory bodies yet at the central and state level, which would kind of make sure that the quality of services across platforms is uniform. But I think we'll get there too. But tele-mental health has changed the landscape for, in fact, what Deepthi said about a lot of Indians living abroad reach back to Indian professionals because it's easier for them. The weight is much lesser. The understanding is much better. So it's changed the landscape in that sense. I think we're yet to tap into the rural India because the access to technology there is limited. But like in that sense, Karnataka is way ahead of other states. So here we have the district mental health program, which is very, very active across all districts. And someone before us spoke about ASHA workers. They do form the pillar of providing rural mental health. And they are trained in basic counseling services, etc. But I think the penetration is still like vastly different from urban cities.
Sure. So let's talk about the future scenario. Say we are talking about 2050, right? There's obviously figures show that there are a lot of neurodegenerative diseases that are expected to escalate. The numbers are expected to escalate. Mental illness is also expected to escalate. We'll never have enough professionals. So what does the care delivery model in the next couple of decades look like? I mean, any of you can take that. How do we bridge the gap in terms of the lack of professionals? And speaking to some of the points that the previous panel talked about, there is an element of humanness that is being lost with too much technology. And I think in mental health, that's even more so, that it's important that that comes through. So maybe all of you can share your thoughts about what that looks like.
See, I think true health is promotion of health. We're still at the phase where we are problem solving and fighting illness. Right. So we're yet to develop the primary care model where we are promoting good health even before illness begins. That is going to happen by taking health to the community. Right. So whether it's schools, teaching life skills very early on to young children, teaching them resilience, how to cope better with stress. If we are able to integrate these models right at the early schooling and early development, I think it will make a huge difference to how mental health shapes up like as they grow into adults. And the same goes for protecting and encouraging safe practices for younger children, especially girls, teaching them about what could be early signs of being a victim of abuse, because a lot of young girls don't even know that they're victims of abuse, and by the time they recognize that, they've already they're dealing with the mental health impact of it. And I think taking health to community would also mean, like as Deepthi was saying, going to setups, setting up lay counselors who could be the first point of contact. Because if I was suffering with any kind of mental health concern, I'm most likely to go to a friend or a family. And if they were already trained, they might be able to pick up and start with helping, and then make sure that they reach the professionals. Right. So not everybody would get access to a professional. Not everyone may feel as open to coming. So I think taking it to the community would really change how this looks.
Right. Sure.
Yeah, I think, just adding on to what she said, and I think Dr. Uma had mentioned it in the earlier panel about feeling that sense of self-worth and adequacy. Yeah. She talked about it, of course, in the context of elderly people, but I think it's equally important throughout our lives, and it's so important as women. I think so much of what we do is tied to self-worth and adequacy, and if we can change that at the grassroots, so community. In fact, this project that we're doing in near Madurai, you see daily wage workers coming and talking about their mental health. That was, I know it sounds far away when we're sitting in a city, but it was so heartwarming to see that, because there was no stigma. They were okay to come and share, and that's where community change happens, not just in urban areas. So I think these kind of setups in rural India is important, because the numbers are terrible for mental health professionals and our population.
Right, yeah. Smita, do you want to share a little bit about your thoughts around what India could do to establish those frameworks that will help address the issue? One is you can look at it from a content perspective, but other aspects as well.
Yeah, I think in terms of where we are going to go for mental health, I really appreciate that you said that we're looking at community-based support, which I think is critical, because I see a lot of startup founders as well, and the focus so far has been on technology, but I also believe that mental health is something unique in the sense that although if you have a cough, you can still go on an app and kind of like just get a cough syrup prescription. Mental health has a slightly more intimate angle to it, and it requires a little bit more of a human connection, right? And not everybody needs therapy, but everybody can benefit from knowing how to manage their mental health, to first understand that, okay, there is something that I can work on, and that's not necessarily PT at school, but that's also not seeing a counselor at school, but that's also learning how we can incorporate mental wellness in all that we do, that it filters down to the relationships that we build. So for me, if you ask, apps can help address some of the gap, but also, yes, what you do in terms of community outreach, I feel is far more far-reaching. But yes, there are never going to be enough mental health professionals to cater to India's population, and that's a fact. I mean, even if you're going to work towards the next 50 years, there'll never be enough. And ultimately we're left with a population that has a growing awareness of what is mental illness, which we did not have before. But the next step is to take that awareness and say, okay, what can I do about this? As a non-mental health professional, I think my first priority, coming from an urban space and as a woman, would be, okay, I know I have this problem and I know I have certain difficulties in my life, and how can I actually go about leading a better life? How can I improve these outcomes for myself? For me, if I'm able to answer that question, I feel that a sufficient gap can be addressed, not to the extent that we would like it to be, but at least to the extent that we can make it possible. So for me, I would say awareness has to come with some degree of action as well.
Great, thank you. Questions from the audience? We have a couple of minutes and then we'll need to wrap up. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you for the enlightening panel discussion. So I want to know about, there is something called consumeristic culture. Like we buy things which we really don't want, and with the money which we really don't have, and to show people who we don't know. So that consumeristic culture is there, and it's still existing from 1800. So I want to know, what is your thought about forced consumeristic culture towards women? Like we are in the state of influencing normal things, like saying everywhere that dark skin is beautiful, but it is, and that is normal. So forced consumeristic culture in women, what is your thought about it? I want to know.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. Thank you. We have to understand that it's multi-layered. I think the forced consumerism comes from a lot of influences which shape our thinking and our decision making in turn, right? And that is something that we're conditioned to believe right from maybe like our formative years itself. So rather than have an opinion on it, I would say each person may have their own opinion, but we need to understand that it's multi-layered, it's reinforced through various impacts. And especially like Deepthi was just highlighting something earlier about like culturally, it's very important to understand the concept of culture. We are more collectivist, as like Asian societies are more collectivist. So we may be more open and accepting of other people, even if it looked like it were something different. So we do create space. And this consumerism in that context comes because it's more individualistic in nature. You know, one person wanting to stand out, and your social media influences and society influences wanting you to be that, encouraging you to be someone who stands out or someone who's different. It may not be important, but I think it does have an impact on how we feel about ourselves in turn. I don't know if that answered your question.
Thank you.
You said forced consumerism.
Yeah.
For me, a red flag is anything that's forced. I would look into that.
Any other questions?
I can just ask it out loud as well. So you said it's very hard to identify a good mental health professional, and not everyone needs like a clinical therapist, right? So how do you sort of sift through what can be seen by whom, and how do you identify a good enough counselor or a clinical therapist? I know there's some membership or qualification that people should look for.
I would place top priority on the goodness of fit, which means what you're looking for should fit with what the therapist is able to offer, more than qualifications. I think if you look at the single most important factor when it comes to, I mean, it's not just about therapist, honestly. Any other person you get in touch with, what leaves you feeling good about that connection is how well the two of you could identify or connect with things, right? So between two humans, even if you're visiting another doctor, you're talking to anyone randomly, how good you felt at the end of it would be the prime most important factor. So the goodness of it would be how comfortable you are, what's the kind of rapport you establish. Any well-trained therapist or any professional would be able to tell you if what you're seeking is out of their professional expertise, and they would be able to then guide you on to who might be the right professional for you. So that may not be your responsibility. think well-trained professionals should be able to guide you on if they don't have the expertise in that. But I think maybe as a consumer, using the word because it just came, but as someone who's seeking out service, I think you might want to look at how comfortable you were made to feel, and if you feel that this is a place where you get the help you want.
Sorry, as a follow-up, so Deepti, having running a therapy practice, of course the consumer or the client or the patient can take measures on their own to establish whether they're going on the right track. But from within a therapist's or therapy practices lens, what are some of the things that are done to make sure that your professionals are kosher, are really...
I think that's really, really important in terms of hygiene. So I think a good practitioner would be in supervision. So they would be in regular supervision. Someone
Can you define that? What does supervision mean for the audience?
So supervision is basically where you as a professional are also being monitored by a professional who's maybe senior, more experienced, and if you feel there's a roadblock. For example, if I'm going through relationship issues, someone comes in front of me who has relationship issues, I forget their story and I'm lost in my own story. Something for me to work on, so I need to take that back to supervision or say, hey, maybe for this time, I'm not having relationship issues, but I'm just using that as an example. But maybe for this time, I need to sort of not see these kind of people. Some people don't see child sexual abuse. It's very triggering for them. So making sure that you're in supervision, having all the right education, I think. Therapy is not listening to someone's story, and unfortunately a lot of people think I'm a good listener, I can listen to your stories. It's a lot more than that. So having that in place as well, and I think for us, since we have a team of 12 therapists who work on our team, when someone writes in, we look at, culturally what is their fit, where are they coming from, what is their age, and as Smita said, it was about pink hair, but many a times I've had clients say, I knew you were the right fit because I like the way you dress. And I said, and to me that was like, I don't know if that's what you should be going by, but yeah.
Great, thanks. We'll have to wrap up now because we are running a bit late. But thank you all, very insightful discussion. I think we talked about, of course, the extent of the problem, but also I think concrete steps that can be taken. You talked about prevention, you talked about awareness, of course, but how prevention and protective factors need to be ingrained at a very early stage. So thank you for that. Thank you for sharing your story and the ideas, and thank you, Deepti. Thanks to the organizers. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, panelists.